Hey guys, in today's video, I'm going to be breaking down a lecture of Manly Hall's, which is officially titled How Hierarchy Communicates with Humans. But one of the main underlying themes that he talks about in this episode is the secret history, the secret destiny of America, or more specifically, America's place within the universal plan. And I'm doing this lecture today, which is February 22nd, 2022, to commemorate what many Western astrologers are talking about in terms of today being America's Pluto return. And let me talk a little bit about what that means. So, America's Pluto return has to do with the fact that at the birth of America, the horoscope of the country, which the Western astrologers who say that today is the date of the Pluto return, they're marking July 4th, 1776 as the birthday, which may or may not be the most appropriate date we can use, but that's the one that Western astrologers are using to announce today being this Pluto return date. The idea is that at the day that America was born in its chart, Pluto held a certain position in Capricorn. I believe it's around 27 degrees. And now, 270 something years later, we have Pluto returning to that point in the zodiac. So that means it's the end of a full cycle of Pluto's travels around the zodiac within America's birth chart. So a couple issues here. The 1776 may or may not be the best date to use as the birth date of America. So that could be a point of contention about whether or not today truly does mark the U.S.'s Pluto return. And then furthermore, as I mentioned in various other episodes on my channel, that there's a difference between the tropical way of measuring the zodiac and the sidereal. And the sidereal tends to take into account the precession that has to do with the great year, the motion of the great year. And so if you factor in that sidereal approach, it looks like the Pluto return might not come for a couple more years. However, Pluto is a very slow-moving planet, and so it's got a wide orb, or the orb of influence stretches for a long period of time. So even if the exact date is pushed forward a couple of years for America's Pluto return, we should expect to see the influence begin to manifest even at this earlier date. So whether or not today is or isn't the perfect date for marking America's Pluto return, there are certain themes that I do think are very prevalent that are important to discuss. And a lot of these themes will be ones that you might be familiar with because they involve Pluto, which is one of the main characters that I discussed in the depth psychology series, particularly in the couple episodes I did on the astrology of this current time period, where we talked in depth about Pluto and in particular Pluto's relationship to Saturn. And so in that series, I discussed how Pluto is indicative of death and rebirth and transformation. And Manly Hall calls it the initiator. So it's sort of like bringing out the unprocessed, the shadow elements within the psyche, in this case of the country. And in a sociological sense, this could also mean the shadow indicating the deep state and the inner elements of the deep state, which I associate with this idea of a secret space program or a secret sort of Manhattan Project style research center or hub that is dealing with etheric physics, which is basically alchemy, a modern rediscovery of alchemy and developing technologies and all types of worldviews and strategic programs based on that manner of thinking that is completely opposite of the scientific materialism and the dogma of that, which is the sort of religion of the ruling classes today, what we would consider the governing structure. So there's the idea that there's this hidden hand behind things, that it's hard to look at the global lockstep coordination between nations and economies and corporations all over the world and policymaking structures all over the world and not get a whiff of the idea that there is a inner hidden transnationalist hand that is pulling the strings and or coordinating things. So there's an idea here that there's multiple layers to this transnational governance structure, and at the innermost level, we're dealing with something that is akin to the mysteries, the priesthood of the mysteries, who are the custodians of the sacred knowledge. In this case, the alchemical knowledge of etheric physics. So we're going to be talking, or Manly Hall is going to be talking a little bit about that today. In this lecture, he's also going to be talking about some of the background of America and how there, throughout history and different cultures, has been a mythology about America's place in the universal plan, and how this is the nation that is going to play a special role in this current age, the sixth age, or excuse me, the fifth age, the Arya, age of the Arya. This larger concept of ages, the Atlantean age and the Aryan age, and this idea of root race. This is something that we explored in my Atlantis zine, which is available at my e-store, PDF and print copies. And there's a bunch of episodes on my channel where we talk about those ideas. So I'm going to revisit a little bit of that today. Manly Hall is going to talk a little bit about the Atlantean foundations of the America, the plan of America, and some of the other more recent mythologies that have to do with the special place of America. And he's also going to talk about this idea that there's a spiritual governance behind worldly affairs. So we're going to be getting into all that. But before we do, I do want to take a couple minutes and read some notes from a couple articles I pulled out on the occasion of this Pluto return and deal with some of the themes of Pluto. And again, we're going to be covering some of the material that we talked about when I previously talked about Pluto in relation to the Pluto-Saturn conjunction of 2020. So hope you enjoy this episode. All right, so I have 3 articles that I picked out, and I'm going to be putting the links of what those articles are in the show description. But the first one is called Turning Point, the United States Pluto Return. And this one was actually written in 2019, and it's by this guy named Ray Grasse, Grasse. So the link will be below for that. He notes that some of the main things of Pluto, these are things that we discussed before, just to overview them. Pluto is associated with the themes of transformation, death, and rebirth, the pitfalls and potentials of power, confronting shadow issues. And again, the shadow has to do with the aspect of yourself that hasn't been brought out to the light of day to be dealt with. And so there's a psychological aspect to this that has to do with repression, but it seems like sociologically there's also an aspect of this that has to do with the deep state. So these are all themes that Pluto seems to be associated with. Historically, it's involved with upheaval, meaning if you look at the Pluto returns for other countries that are older, such as Britain or like the Roman Empire, you'll see these certain themes come out. So one of those is Pluto returns tend to be associated with upheaval, and at times even with the collapse of an empire or a nation. And he also notes that Pluto transits involve contending with some unresolved darkness or transgression from the past. Again, I think this is a key element with this deep state concept, born out of really the new money class that arose at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and the motion of global society to embrace certain energy forms that lend themselves well to oligarchical control and to cartel sort of economic structures. And that bred a new money class. At the same time, you see the rise of the corporation and the rise of these major corporate bureaucracies. And at the same time, you see the motion of the finance world into a global sort of central bank structure, which after World War II became consolidated in the Bank of International Settlements. And then also after World War II, you see the rise through the U.S., or actors in the U.S., the rise of these transnational policy-making groups and transnational organizations. And so all of those breeds this very elite group of decision makers and elite groups of organizations who have outsized agency with respect to the normal democratic structures that were set up really during a time of agrarian economies and societies organized on agrarian concepts. So we have a sort of a major social transformation happen relatively soon after the Republican model of democracy being set up all over the world. And these new economic structures and organizational structures and corporate structures, and you have the birth of the social sciences and birth of psychology, and all these instruments become leveraged to create something that exists really beyond and outside of the normal democratic institutions that were set up. And so if we bundle all that together, that new power structure is called the deep state, or at least an aspect, the innermost aspect of that, because it's something that is running in a somewhat autonomously from the normal democratic institutions of the nation state and is not accountable to them. And I have a lot of research that shows that it seems to be running financially independent of the normal flows of money between nations. For example, the drug trade or the war on drugs seems to be an aspect of this deep state in terms of financing and funding itself off the books. And there's other elements that we can look at in the 20th century as emerging as a type of independent financial structure. So that's just one example of how you have the emergence of a class, or you could think of a caste situation that is outside of and somewhat independent and autonomous of the rest of society, and which Dolan calls it a breakaway civilization. But I think it really is more having to do with the modern recapitulation of the ancient caste structure. And the idea here is that we're not even aware that there are these castes that have access to knowledge and exert influence and power at a level that is unseen to most. So this could be a type of collective shadow, at least as far as the majority of people on Earth are concerned. And the secrecy that it enjoys can metastasize itself into like a cancer because it seeks its own perpetuation for the sake of itself. So it's like a cancer. But just to return now to specifically this article that we're looking at, some of the implications that this author notes for Pluto transits, again, continuing with unresolved darkness or transgressions from the past, such as the shadow. But if you are able to successfully confront these shadow elements and to integrate them into yourself, not to do battle with them, but to understand that they need to be integrated and become part of our understanding of how we work. So on a sociological level, it could mean incorporating these elements of the deep state into something that is actually in harmony with the larger purposes of society. So anyway, the Pluto is involved with this process of transformation and dealing with the unresolved aspects of ourselves. And that all kind of comes under the auspices of this death and rebirth theme. So anyway, he points out those themes. So specifically implications for the U.S., he notes some things that are very timely. He says economic tumult. And again, this article was written in 2019. So these are themes that it's interesting to see how they've arisen in a very timely way at this current moment. But he says economic tumult at a moment where we're having inflation, or a moment we're having much talk about the Federal Reserve being ready to implement some changes in their interest rate policy, which could have dynamic effects on global financial markets, particularly concerning the fragility of financial markets and the interconnection of them, and the whole derivative situation, in which one relatively minor default could cascade. So all this is happening right at this moment. We have social unrest that is very tied into something we're seeing above the U.S.'s border in Canada right now with the trucker protests and the recent actions of Trudeau in terms of basically exercising emergency powers and exercising a type of military type of dictatorship influence over the country. And just today I saw talk of there being a U.S. imitation of this with truckers coming to D.C., so we'll have to see how that plays out. But anyway, that's going on with social unrest. And of course, just all the past several years have just been dominated by different types of social unrest in different parts of the country. Military conflicts. At this current moment in time, we have this whole episode with Ukraine, which, I have absolutely zero trust that you're getting a true story of anything having to do with, military and foreign policy, or really anything when it comes to the national media. But there are definitely front page headlines everywhere about possibly confrontation in Ukraine. So I'm just going to point that out as being a potential tie in with what he's talking about in this article. He talks about the rise of autocratic motions, meaning basically like kind of fascist things like we were talking about with Canada just now. I mean, I think you could see a lot of those tendencies with this Biden administration and this sort of totalitarian, all full spectrum dominance control by the state, the centralization of power, the motion away from democratic institutions, and the mandates are kind of a good case study of that. And then this is another interesting thing because this is falling in Capricorn. He notes that Pluto in Capricorn can also indicate scandals and falls from grace for prominent individuals. Now, this is at a time when just a couple of days ago, an associate of Maxwell and Epstein was just killed in a similar way as Epstein was in his cell, where he was supposedly found hanged and the security footage wasn't working. It's all very suspicious. And but anyway, this idea that there are scandals at a very high level is something that we're seeing playing out in real time. So those are the notes I have for that article. All right, so moving on to the next article. It's called "The United States Pluto Return," and it's by Grace Cloyd. And again, this link will be below. She notes that Pluto represents the power of transformation, like as we're talking about, the ending or death of one way or order of being in order to create space for a new way, a new pattern to emerge. So classic death rebirth themes here. And she talks about confronting the shadow. When our deepest fears are overcome and our deepest darkness is illuminated, we are transformed. Our lives can never be the same as they were before. Pluto is literally the destruction or collapse of an old way of being. And it seems clear that that's part of what's happening in the world, I think, is the outcome of this is going to be the move into a formal transnational global set of governance and a new currency regime to match that. That one that's not explicitly based on the dollar hegemony, which means that the dollar being the reserve currency of the world. There's already been a gradual motion away from that in Asia and with Russia and in countries in the Middle East and a little bit in Africa, but that's going to be explicitly formalized, in my opinion, in the upcoming years. And I think everything that's happening in the world today is a preface for that. She has some more notes to say about Capricorn. Pluto is currently moving to the sign of Capricorn. So she writes that, she says that Capricorn represents our social infrastructures and institutions, the aspects of society which determine and enforce the laws and policies, such as governments, executive boards, and other hierarchical structures. So it's interesting, she's pointing out that Pluto is acting on Capricorn, and that has to do with these Pluto influences, specifically moving into government and the executive branch or executive boardrooms within corporations, and it's basically structures of the social hierarchy. And these are all themes that we've been emphasizing today or in this discussion. So that's very important to note, or very interesting to note, the dynamics between Pluto and Capricorn. And furthermore, Capricorn has a strong paternal archetype and can be disciplinarian and or authoritarian in nature. And again, with the Biden administration, the Trudeau administration, and all these countries across Europe, you see those themes playing out. The paternalism of it, the idea that the state's going to mandate your health outcomes or mandate, what is or isn't acceptable. And so, yeah, these sort of fascist themes that we see are being activated, it seems, by this Pluto and Capricorn theme. So, or this Pluto and Capricorn relationship. And it's interesting to note that Pluto moved into Capricorn in 2008, at least according to the typical Western view. It moved into Capricorn in 2008, which was the date of the financial bailouts. So the crisis and then the bailouts. And all that is also associated with the neoliberal agenda kind of ramping up in terms of what came after that with the NSA revelations and the sort of the war on terror on the Obama phase, which is like secret covert wars. And so there seems to be a theme underlying this Pluto and Capricorn dynamic that stretches back to 2008 and is moving up through today. And actually, I think Pluto is supposed to be staying in Capricorn through 2024. Or actually, she said it might be 2028 when Pluto officially leaves Capricorn. So there might be some retrograde motion there that brings it out back into Capricorn from Aquarius. So anyway, we'll have to keep our eye on that. And I just want to note one more article here. It's called The Pluto Return to the USA 2022 to 2024. It's by an author named Tanaz. And she indicates some of the effects that we should see with this dynamic of Pluto's return. So she also indicates the relationship between Pluto and Capricorn, noting that there will be a spotlight on government, big business, authority figures, and essentially anyone in a position of great power. And it seems that all the people in positions of great power right now are ones who are in somewhat manifestations of this collective social shadow complex that we have, like the outer branches of this deep state entity. Anyway, she notes that the energy of Pluto's return in Capricorn is like the dark night of the soul of the country. It challenges the U.S. to face up to its dark side and to expose any corruption. We have to remedy the past so we can create a brighter future. She also notes that while a Pluto return can expose shadows, it is also an incredibly powerful transit that can help any country to rise up and reach its full potential. So when the Pluto return is officially completed, it will be like the phoenix rising from the ashes. Again, death and rebirth, themes that we've been discussing at length in this channel. And so her last notes here are that a Pluto return in Capricorn could manifest as the crumbling of the government or an established hierarchy, while at the same time the building of a new one. And, one interesting thing is I've been seeing some really good research lately on the World Economic Forum, which is basically the organization behind Davos. And there's a link between the leadership group that the World Economic Forum has sponsored over the past 20 to 30 years and the main actors on the world stage who are behind this lockstep move between this partnership between corporations and nation states, the executive class specifically of nation states, and these policy institutions, such as the World Health Organization. And there's interesting that the leadership class of these various groups are all connected to the World Economic Forum in an important way. And this even includes Bill Gates. But it includes, people like Merkel and Germany. And I'll have to do a whole episode on this coming up. But this seems like the fact that it's so obvious that there's this group in charge seems like this would be the one that it's going to fall. This whole class of capitalism and of this current neoliberal paradigm of global politics is what's going to succumb at the end of this whole period of time as the sort of thing that's sacrificed while we build a new global civilization. I just don't see our global civilization being led by this current leadership group. I think it's too obvious that they're corrupt and the connections between these people are too transparent. So that's just my feeling. So to wrap it up, she notes that this whole period can lead to deep and lasting changes in the way the country is run and governed, and in the rules that citizens choose to abide by. And then finally, Pluto is going to bring a revolution of sorts. It seems that whatever intention was set for this country back on July 4th, 1776 is going to be revisited. And now this brings us to the topic of Manly Hall's lecture, which is the underlying esoteric intention of America, the secret destiny, the role of America in the universal plan. So we're going to start off by hearing Manly Hall's introduction, and then he's going to go into the Atlantean background that sets the stage for America in its place in this current age.
I will not try to give Dr. Irwin's talk this morning. I don't know just how he intended to do it. But we will try to cover some phases of the theme with which his morning talk was dedicated, and that is the place of America in the world plan of things. So we're going to start quite a long ways back. There have been all kinds of interesting accounts, and we are told that the Seminoles of Florida originally believed and affirmed definitely that there was a land bridge between Europe and America at a very ancient time, that this land bridge was probably the lost continent of Atlantis. Now, the Atlanteans seemingly had certain concepts that were important, but as Plato points out, they rose against the truth. They destroyed themselves by the corruption of knowledge. They created a scientific empire, and their own sciences destroyed them. And this was the record that was kept in the subterranean caves and grottos in Egypt under the temple of Isis at Sais. There was the story of the land that destroyed itself by losing its own virtues, by corrupting its own ways.
All right, I'd like to quickly pause here and read a little excerpt from my Atlantis zine that's on the topic of Atlantis's fall into corruption and how that led to the overall catastrophe that led to the destruction of that whole civilization pattern. So this is from page 15 under the subheading Atlantis and the Archetype of the Fall. And this is from Manly Hall. Quote, "If an ancient world was destroyed by the human abuse of universal energies, such misuse of power must have resulted from the perversion of old religious magic. Such fragments of ancient tradition that have survived state in various degrees of definiteness that an antediluvian society was destroyed because it departed from the ways of the gods, disobeyed heaven, and fell into sorcery. This explanation becomes acceptable if we wish to assume that sorcery is a fact in nature and that the sorcerer is capable of upsetting the equilibrium in the field of energy which maintains the balance of life." So if we keep that in mind, this idea of a degeneracy and violating the laws of nature and having that violation come back on you as a destructive force and a type of karma pattern, if we think now, fast forwarding today, about things that we might hear about regarding experiments at CERN or with HARP, which are these ideas that we are trying to manipulate the fabric of the way energy and matter is structured in nature for whatever purposes the groups behind those things are using. If we think about the chemtrail aspect or various other types of weird scientific programs that you kind of hear about in the underground world of, I hate the word conspiracy theory, but that kind of general field, without saying it with any definitiveness that we know exactly what's going on, but just the idea that there are weird experimental programs going on in science and weird type of social engineering and environmental engineering programs underway, we can get an idea that there is perhaps an Atlantean archetype that's expressing itself upon our current era, a type of karma from the past that we're recapitulating in order to gradually learn the lesson that we didn't learn as a human species in this previous era. So the idea is that the Atlantean age gave way to our current era, or the current age, but in that transition we inherited the karma from the past. And that the destiny of our age is not to be the same as the destiny of the Atlantean age, in that we're not destined to experience a great fall, but we do have to be confronted with those same themes that took place in the past in order that we may learn to overcome them in the way that they were not able to overcome them in this previous age. So we're going through a modern sort of version, in my opinion, of this Atlantean archetype, of the corruption and misuse of science. And so I have another quote I want to read, from the same zine. This is page 17, under the subheading, "The Dangers of Pride and Arrogance." So Manly Hall writes here, The Atlanteans as a culture became arrogant, selfish, despotic, and developed a complex for world domination and world dominion. The old priesthood, departing from the laws governing the use of its powers, developed temporal ambitions and abetted the avarice of the aristocracy. By means of their sacerdotal sciences, these Atlantean wizards invoked universal energies and forces to further their temporal ambitions. These cosmic energies, once loosened, turned upon their masters. Like Faust's familiar spirit finally destroyed the conjurers who invoked them. And then I have another quote here under the heading, A Lesson We Must Learn Today. Quote, "At the moment, we are somewhat perturbed because a small group of our scientists appear to have overreached themselves. The magic of science threatens to escape from human control to the degree that we may become the victims of our own new and useful improvements. Suppose in those old days, when the science of magic enjoyed universal acceptance and magicians were in the vanguard of progress, a parallel situation had existed. The science of magic overstepped itself through the persons of certain priests who had discovered the esoteric secrets of universal power. Probably they were no wiser in the use of their newfound instrument of personal gratification than we are today." And so it's this technocratic elite that's integrated not only with corporate oligarchy, but I think more specifically with the national security state and with the think tanks and consulting organizations that run that system or behind that system. That's the group I see as this new version of the Atlantean priesthood that we have to deal with and grapple with in order to overcome this situation that we're in. Now we're going to return to Manly Hall, and he's going to talk about how the Atlantean civilization pattern, after the main hub, which is the island chain in the Atlantic Ocean, after that collapsed as part of the deluge, he's going to talk about how the Atlantean civilization had hubs or outposts throughout the world, and how these became the seeding ground in which the civilization pattern of Atlantis would become seeded into the Aryan Age. And that sets the stage for us to understand the early foundations of America, the Mayan civilization. And then from there, we're going to be gradually moving into later civilization patterns that had to do with the Americas in this new era, this post-Atlantean era.
But also Plato told us that there was a great navigation, a great mercantile between Atlantis and the other parts of the then known world. The Atlantean traders and merchants traveled into most distant places with very reliable and suitable ships, and carried goods and merchandise with them for trade and barter. Now it seems there is a possibility worth remembering that these merchants were not too different from merchants later. We know, for example, that when the Etruscans and the Near Eastern peoples entered into a trade with Western Europe, that their ships came along the coast of Europe into Great Britain and onto the coast of France, and that in doing so they left a great deal of the ancient beliefs and wisdoms of their people on the Western Hemisphere, on the European Hemisphere. So that we have given a thought to the idea that the Atlantean navigators very probably brought with them some colonizers. They traded, they did various things, but they also brought missionaries. They brought the same kind of traveler that we find in modern times. When a country opens another country to commerce, they send educators, they send all kinds of people, doctors and ministers, to advance the cultures of these new neighbors that they have made. Now, at some remote time, this seemingly happened in connection with the Atlantean distribution of land. For in this time, it would seem that these navigators landed on various areas and established centers of their own culture. Every nation of importance has the same origin legends, identical in every respect, that at a great time past, which men have no longer the memory of, ships, dragons, boats, mysterious flying monsters came out of the sea. And from these came forth founders and creators of nations. And they came ashore, and they set up various colonies in the area where this navigation existed. In the case of the Aztec Maya complex, we are told that out of the sea came a raft of serpents, which was probably a boat. And on this raft was a mysterious elder, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. And he was a strange person, but he was not an Indian. He was probably as described as a light-complexioned person. He wore long robes and a great feathered bonnet, and on his robes were crosses, and he carried a crozier in his hand. And he came ashore near what is now Veracruz, and he taught the people. He gave them instructions in agriculture. He taught them medicine and art. He taught them the laws by which they could build a permanent culture. He gave them a written language, and he also gave them the rules of architecture, husbandry, and all of the learned cultures, including music, poetry, and literature. And having established a firm government, he then went back into the sea. He called for the raft of serpents, and it came back. And before he left, he turned to the people and said, "Take care of the things I have given you, and I will come back and rule over you again." So they kept the word, but he never came back. Instead of that came Cortez, much later. But when Montezuma knew that the ships of Cortez had arrived off the coast of Mexico, he sent messengers carrying with them the bonnet of the emperor, because he thought it was Quetzalcoatl returning. And he told his messengers to tell that he had kept the rules that had been given to him, and he was ready to turn over the empire to Quetzalcoatl. It was this misunderstanding that, with its tragic consequences, that contributed considerably to the fall of Mexico, so far as the native population was concerned. On the other side of the world, in Chaldea and Babylonia, there rose out of the sea a mysterious being, Oannes the fishman. This man came from somewhere beyond the oceans, and he walked upon the land, and he had a body of a human being and the head of a fish. I might remind you that the bishop's mitre is the head of a fish. And this being taught the people. He gave them the language. He taught them medicine and art. He taught them agriculture. He taught exactly the same things that Quetzalcoatl had taught to the Western Hemisphere. He also returned to the sea and said he would return, but he never came back. Now, it is believed by some at least that these were from the Atlantean continent. They were civilizers from that mysterious land that vanished away, according to the Codex Torano, taking 60 million people to death in a single night. The reason they never came back was because they had been destroyed. But at the same time, there seems to be a great distribution of culture that traces back all the way to the Atlantean period, in which the foundations of civilization as we know them have their footings and bases.
All right, so we have this idea of Atlantis as the colonizing agent that sets up basically civilization in this modern era. And by modern era, I mean the past, going back to 10,000 BC, the past 1,200 years, or 12,000 years. And so America's story is intertwined with this Atlantean story and the fall of Atlantis. And I also want to point out that we talked about how the Atlantis pattern fell with a priesthood falling from grace. And then we also have this idea of Atlantis as a colonizing force that brings civilization to these outlying areas across the globe. And I think we have to keep in mind, this is something I talk about in the zine, that Atlantis, the priesthood had kind of fragmented, and the priesthood that fell was a certain branch of it. But there was also, we can think of a aspect of the Atlanteans that was opposed to the situation that ultimately ended up with the collapse of that race. And Manly Hall talks about how actually the Aryan cycle was set up by a priesthood, an aspect of the priesthood of Atlantis, who went and left Atlantis after having warned the people against the trajectory they were on, and they left and went to India, and then became ensouled by the Manu of the fifth age, so the Manu becomes the archetype of modern humanity, and the peoples of that Himalayan region set out the basic design pattern of civilization in this current age. So, and then from India, they branched out and would implement their pattern across the world. And so that's the world that we live in today is an extension of, or a mix, you could say, of certain features from the Atlantean era or certain karmic patterns blended with the influence of the cycle of the Arya, which comes out from the Himalayas and the Manu and the peoples of that region, which took place a long time ago. So anyway, that's all covered in the Atlanticene. I just want to point out that the civilizing force could have been not necessarily been the evil, destructive force that we were talking about as the one that led to the fall of Atlantis. So now we're going to jump forward in time, and we're going to be looking at the Greeks and the myth that the Greeks had about a Western land across the oceans, which was set aside for a special purpose in this current age.
One of the most interesting early records that we have in a little book in the library on the navigations of the Greeks as recorded by Plutarch. According to Plutarch, Greek explorers actually discovered the mouth of the St. Lawrence River and explored part of the territory that is now in the northeastern part of the United States and southern Canada. They took back the legends and stories of their journey. They reported a beautiful and fertile land that had never been ruined or disturbed or destroyed by the sins of mankind. They described in considerable detail the boundaries of this wonderful region. And from the story that they left, a whole group of utopian legends developed. These legends had to do with this wonderful world beyond the sea, where all things were going to be wonderful and beautiful. And in due time, this land, which had been set aside by the gods for the preservation of civilization, was to be a mysterious ark-like vessel into which would flow those of the world who appreciated and understood the real destiny of man, the spiritual problem that man would face, and his victory over the sorrows and iniquities of his environment and the weaknesses of his own nature.
So I want to just point out, after I published my Atlanticene, I broke ground on the follow-up to that, which I'm still going to be publishing in the future. But it was about the ancient America and this story of Atlantis moving into the influence of Atlantis in America, and what was special about the Western Hemisphere. So when Manly Hall mentions America, he's really talking about South, Central, and North America, not just the United States of America, but this whole Western Hemisphere. He talks about how this is the area where there's going to be what I interpret as the final overcoming of this Atlantean pattern, and the sort of destiny of this fifth age will be fulfilled. So we'll be getting more into that through this lecture. But I just want to point out, I do have a whole publication and a lot more content to provide about the Americas that I'll be getting into in the future. But in these next several clips, we're going to be jumping a little bit around the history of different civilization patterns in the Americas. And in this first one here, he's going to be talking about the American Indians and their heritage as being the progenitors of democracy. So check it out.
Another very interesting legend dealing with this particular problem evolved right here on the Western Hemisphere. We have overlooked many things. If you ask today where democracy began, most people will probably suggest the Swiss Confederation, in which a series of cooperative units, separated by language and by many customs, were able to form a confraternity of social purposes that has continued even to this time. Actually, however, democracy began much earlier. Democracy apparently began here in the Western Hemisphere. It was a birthright of the land itself. It came long before any travelers from other regions established settlements here. There were three great areas in which political and governmental structures were allowed to grow and unfold in the Western Hemisphere. These were North America, Central America, and South America. North America was the center of the Indian and Indo-American culture, and probably the most interesting and important of these particular groups was the great League of the Iroquois nation. This league was developed and perfected before the arrival of the foreign travelers and colonizers. This league was originally the League of the Five Nations, but later became the League of the Six Nations. And this is the League of Nations, according to historical record, that inspired Woodrow Wilson to formulate the 14 points of his League of Nations. So in the Northern Hemisphere, we had the great League of the Iroquois people. And their symbol was the great white cloud of the peace. Their idea was the long house. And the long house was the world. And the sky was the roof. And the earth was the floor. And the wonderful mountains and forests and rivers and lakes were the walls. And here, human beings met in the great peace under the sky. These people had a very interesting series of rules. In the Iroquois League, those who we would call senators today were called sachems. They were the wise ones, and they were elected by the tribes. Now, it is interesting to note that while these sachems were all men, the only ones who could elect them were women. The women did not sit in the lodge, but they selected every one of them by vote, and the men were not allowed to vote. This is quite an interesting thing to happen long ago. Now, when these sachems met together also, they were subject to certain rules. One was that no member of the League could vote for any project affecting his own group. In other words, he could vote for any state except his own. He had to be silent as to anything that would benefit him. He could vote on the benefits of others, but others had to vote on the benefits for him. Another very interesting point is that in the League of the Iroquois, decorum was the order of the day. Decorum was the most important thing of all. When a sachem arose, the chairman said, "The door is open." Therefore, the sachem or senator was able to give his speech, to tell what he considered to be important and necessary, to bring news, or to ask consideration for special privileges. No one was permitted to interrupt him. When he was through, he sat down. Then it was right for others to speak. but no criticism, no voice of anger, no temper, no conspiracies, no plots, no cartels were permitted under any condition. All relations had to be noble, they had to be gentle, they had to be wise, and they had to be kind. And anyone who broke that rule was thrown out. Now that's something rather interesting, starting among Aborigines, who, as one English author said, it was remarkable that this type of government, perhaps the highest form of democracy the world has ever known, came into existence among a group of Indians in blankets and feathers sitting under a tree.
Now from North America, we're going to go south to look at the heritage of the Mayans.
Now further to the south was the double empire of the Aztec and the Maya. And here we had another interesting example. We generally think of the Aztec Maya Empire as being ruled over by emperors. But in this case, there was a strange similarity between their way of doing it and the practice that was then in vogue in India and Nepal 25 centuries ago. It is true that they had an emperor, but this emperor was not hereditary. He ruled during his own lifetime by election. And when he passed on, he could not nominate a successor. The successor had to be selected by the people and tested, not by the ballot, but by conduct. The new ruler had to have courage. He had to be brave in the presence of adversity. He had to be wise, capable of judging correctly the needs of the people. He had to love the people and take care of them and protect them and prove over a long period of time that he accepted a responsibility for them and not an opportunity for his own advancement. And when he had been checked, proved, and carefully examined and initiated into their religious rites, then he might be installed. But he would always have to be appointed by the people and not by any hereditary group or by any class or caste. As a result of that, we find in the Central American area some very interesting points that perhaps are worth remembering. First of all, that entire civilization never had a medium of exchange. No currency, no money. And yet they built over 60 cities. And many of those cities had populations running into the hundreds of thousands. They never had a wheel. They never had a bow and arrow. But, of course, they did have the glottal, the throwing spear, for protection. But they were very interesting people in many ways. For example, a young person, man or woman, had to accept as part of his birthright that he was the servant of the needs of all the people. He was not allowed to build a career in conflict with the needs of the people. He was not allowed to be competitive in relationship with other people. These things were forbidden him. He had to always consider the common good. He had to maintain the integrity, for any lowering of his own morale or his morality was considered as a desperate danger to the people. So here we had a people that became very much given to architecture, to astronomy. When the Spaniards came over here, they corrected their calendars from the Maya calendar. They were not a group of Aborigines, but a very interesting and wonderful people. And the great Florentine Sahagún, a great manuscript relating to the life of these people in the Laurentian Museum Library in Florence, describes a culture that is magnificent in its scope, and yet strangely barbaric, but barbaric with certain simple rules. Be honest. It's perfectly possible for a barbarian to be honest. and it is perfectly possible for a civilized person to be dishonest. So these people live by a very simple but powerful code. Further to the south, the great hierarchy of the Incas in Peru and in that area were very largely politically structured like the Aztecs and the Maya. When Pizarro came into the area to conquer it, he came to a people that had never known war as we know it today. They were not people of war. One day Pizarro said to the Inca, he said, "What do you do with criminals in Peru, in your country?" And the Indian didn't seem to quite understand, so Pizarro explained more carefully that the criminal was the lawbreaker, and so on and so on. And the Inca replied, "I don't know what we do with them. We don't have any." On another occasion, when a foreign tribe entered the country, the Peruvians met them with dull weapons, took them without hurting them seriously, made them prisoners, and gave them the right to remain for 5 years under surveillance until it was proven that they were persons of integrity. Then they were given allotments of land and citizenship in the Inca Empire, even though they had come in to invade it. These kind of things were happening here, and they all added together to some of the most interesting factors in the development of our way of life. We have taken much from them, and we could take a little more.
Now, in the full version of the lecture, Manly Hall moves over to Europe and Asia and talks about some of the myths that exist in those regions that have to do with the existence of a fabled land, a region that was set aside for a special purpose. But just to make things a little bit condensed, I'm going to skip those sections and jump right to Francis Bacon's utopian vision of the New Atlantis. And so right here, Manly Hall is going to make explicit some of the main ideas that have to do, when you aggregate these myths together and look at what the common themes are, this has to do with this idea that there is a Western hemisphere which was set aside for a special purpose. So here's what Manly Hall has to say about that.
Now, from a very early time, the idea of a utopia was strongly fixed in the mind of the people. But the dream went on through More's Utopia, through Bacon's New Atlantis. And in Bacon we find the summarizing of the whole concept, the New Atlantis, which is America. And here, from a very early time, from the first navigations of Columbus and those who followed him, there was the realization that this continent had been set aside by a power beyond that of man to provide the homeland of a united people bound together, as Gandhi said, by nothing stronger than the silken thread of love. That here was to be the great experiment. Here was the place in which the great involutionary processes of nations would be reversed and a great evolutionary process would set in. That opportunities and privileges and rights, that a clean earth free from the conspiracies of Europe would be able to accomplish that which was necessary. The Hindus have records of the ancient will of the gods on these matters. We hear the stories of the secret governments behind the government of the earth, that the spiritual laws that must be fulfilled in the due course of time, and that the fate of mankind finally does not rest completely in the hands of men, but in the hands of the divine plan, which man must ultimately learn to accept and obey.
So here, Manly Hall makes an important point. He says that this fabled nation of the Americas, this land, this sacred land, would be the place where the involutionary motion would take its turn for this current age, and would move into its evolutionary phase, in which case it fulfills its destiny and leads into the sixth age. So America becomes the age where this tension between the Atlantean karma and the Atlantean archetype and the Aryan, the potential of this Aryan pattern, which is the archetype of the Fifth Age, where they meet and the battle is going to be waged. But he's going to make the case that America and the sacred land will not lose this battle, and that the destiny will be fulfilled. And then at the end of that clip, he makes a point that we're going to be exploring further into this episode, which is that the true governance structure is a spiritual one. Now, coming up, he's going to go into the influence of these myths, these utopian myths, on the founding fathers of America and the groups that were responsible, which are very tightly connected to Francis Bacon, actually. But the basic motives underlying the move to colonize America were informed by this myths that America had a special purpose. And in other works of his, he talks about how there were earlier opportunities for America to be colonized, but that the secret societies in Europe had forbade this to take place, and they were waiting for a particular time and purpose for this colonization to be ensouled. And then Francis Bacon was the one who catalyzed that process and set the things in motion that led to what would become the United States of America.
Now, after the gradual development of a concept of the Western world, after the voyages of Drake and the voyages of Columbus and Magellan and all these travelers, the new land began to open up as a great center of future world culture. At about the same time, there were rumblings in Europe of the impossibility of developing a permanent, unified culture in Europe. Europe was locked in wars, from the Crusades to the 100 Years' War and the 30 Years' War. It was all conflict and struggle between small, petty despots to control the common people. There's no doubt in the world that the founding fathers of this country were at least in part aware of the older stories, because they were on everyone's lips in those days, as strange tales are now constantly repeated and disseminated. There is no doubt in the world that a plan was instituted, by means of which it was hoped that the mysterious powers behind our normal way of life were guiding this nation to its full destiny. Now, the interruptions and sorrows of this situation have also been carefully mentioned. We know the vision of Lincoln and his own realization that his destiny had come. Lincoln definitely realized or believed that he was there for a purpose, and that purpose fulfilled, he saw the black ship that would carry him away forever. There was the prophecy that was written the day of the birth of George Washington, telling through the problems and the difficulties of the nation. There is also the story of the prophecy of Valley Forge, where George Washington saw the future of the country, saw the great trials through which it would pass, but realized that it would emerge triumphantly in the end. There was Macmillan's dream, the dream of the American general. From the inside of man himself, there seemed to be constantly emerging visions, dreams, and hopes, which he believed should someday be brought together to form a new way of life for people in this world. And now, as the result of so many of these older plans, the carefully laid foundations that were some of them built 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, we have come to our present emergency, an emergency which, strangely enough, seems to be really unnecessary. An emergency in which a people, educated, cultured, skillful, a people basically of good intention have managed to bind themselves into a turmoil, into a crisis, into a criticism. Yet we are still informed by the scriptures of old and by the mystic yearnings of the sages that this situation will not prevail against the common good, that the purpose of the great brotherhood that guides the world is that this nation shall survive. It shall survive because it was destined, and it shall survive because that which put it in motion is stronger than anything that can be used against it. But in this moment or this time of stress and trial, it is very important that there must be a growing and enlarging realization of the essential purpose for which this nation was founded. It is no longer simply to be considered as another adventure in competition and conspiracy. But the plan of things seems to indicate to us that the answer in the end will be what is deemed to be right. The good will come. This is not, as Simon Bolivar said before, the great Latin American patriot, he said, America is not a country. America is an assignment of destiny. Now, people don't think much of assignments of destiny. We are all gravely troubled. We are all worried and frightened by situations which we find beyond our control. But if we are correct, and I believe we are, that there is a destiny that is beyond our own keeping, that man has the right to make mistakes, but he does not have the right to destroy himself.
So there is a divine plan behind things, and America has a place in this divine plan. And this divine plan impresses itself upon the world from within, meaning the archetype is held within consciousness itself and reveals itself through consciousness. That's why he talks about these key visions and experiences that were had by these critical figures in American history and in world history, and how they inspired them to do the things that they did. Now, in this next clip, we're going to be looking a little bit about what makes America particularly unique and special. And he's going to point out that America was one of the first nations, if not the first, to become this polyglot, this melting pot of different ethnicities. And in that way, it becomes somewhat of a microcosm for the world as a whole. So it becomes a place where different experiments can happen, cultural experiments can happen that can then be brought out to the world. And that, if we look back at the history of the past 200 years, you can see that a lot of innovations that took place in America were brought out into the world. So that would sort of ring true. And then we're going to be progressing from there.
Now, for a long time, we opened our gates here to emigration from other countries. The tired, the weary, the persecuted, the underprivileged came here. And gradually out of this we have developed a strange melting pot. We are continuing to build up what might be termed an international nation. We are building up gradually through the years a concept of peoples of all groups, all backgrounds, all races, being able to unite for the great purpose of fulfilling the destiny of the human being, rather than merely the political contrivances of physical leadership. So we have here now, more and more, a representative group of persons.
Now in these upcoming clips, we're going to be moving more into talking about certain themes, ones that are particularly relevant to where we started the video off, talking about America's Pluto return, and Pluto being related to the initiator and the death and rebirth process and the confrontation with the shadow. And so Manly Hall here is going to be talking a lot about the idea that conflict is necessary for growth to occur. And if we recall back to our discussion on Atlantis, we can understand that maybe we're inheriting a pattern from the past that has gone unconfronted, that we haven't overcome yet, and that this whole paradigm of civilization that we're in and all the pitfalls that are very prevalent about what we're doing to ourselves and to the earth, that these themes maybe tie into this Atlantis concept, and the fact that we're confronting them again is reminding me somewhat of Stan Grof's concept of the cosmic game, that all of this is taking place as an exercise in consciousness, and that there's a certain experiential value to undergoing the type of suffering and pain that we've been going through as a collective in this recent era, and that the ultimate plan and purpose of these experiences is for us to grow and to evolve and to overcome the areas of shortcomings that we have. So keep all that in mind as we hear this next stretch of clips.
Worldliness is gradually coming to an end. We are not going to be able to maintain it much longer. Worldliness is the individual investing his hopes, his beliefs, his fears, and his securities in material things, the most fragile and impermanent of all. There is no permanence in this world. There is no permanence in the institutions that we build. Many of them do not even last as long as we do. There is no security in this material state of things. Security consists of the unfoldment of eternals and principles within ourselves. There can be no security except that which can be earned or manifested from within the depth of ourselves. And we are being tempered as by a fire of adversity, but we are not going to be destroyed. We are gradually going to find the answer that we know is an answer founded in religion, founded in spiritual values, in integrities, in morality, and in ethics. And we'll see this gradually developing right now in this world. Millions of people who not long ago had very little but superficial thoughts are now beginning to sense the importance of investigating, considering, enlarging, and improving their own inner lives and making new and gracious dedications to the common good. We ought to be well aware that, contrary to general opinion, innocence and virtue are not the same thing. Innocence is ignorance, weakness. The individual who is right because he doesn't know what right and wrong are. But with man, as Aquinas tells us, with his definite power of choice, innocence must gradually give way to suffering, and suffering in turn must give way to virtue. The end of all our striving is the transformation of ignorance into virtue. This unfoldment is now being stimulated as never before in history. We have never been in an emergency before in which it was more necessary to make constructive decisions. We may not make them immediately. We may have some more suffering to go through. But the plan of the ages will not be defeated. And that which we have suffered so long to learn is not going to be lost. According to our belief in reincarnation, the individual has lived long and many times to get as far as he has now. He has suffered much in growth already. He has gone through many tragedies, some of which are recorded on the pages of history, and others are recorded only on the tablets of the soul. But he has gone through much. He has struggled through all kinds of sorrows and tragedies and misfortunes. He has been victimized many times. He has victimized himself many times. But through it all, he has come to now. And this long journey is not going to be frustrated. It may take time before the internal is strong enough to control the external. But that's what has been building up since the beginning. Man's gradual victory over the weaknesses in himself. And this victory must continue until it is accomplished.
So now, playing off these ideas, Manly Hall is going to be talking about the invisible government of the world. And by that he means a order of enlightened humans, and so far as when you become enlightened, the universal self awakens within you, so you become an agent and instrument of the universal self, who is the creator and participant in this cosmic game. And so these awakened beings, or these Illuminati, in the literal meaning of the word, they become the agents by which the archetype for creation, or the divine plan, they become the agents for its implementation. And we are following that plan whether we realize it or not. And the ultimate destiny of the plan is to have this great cosmic meditation come to a completion. But here, Manly Hall is going to talk about this concept of the invisible government of the world. And keep in mind the concept of metaphysics and the idea that beyond the physical is a metaphysical or a series of metaphysical dimensions, and that would be the homeland. These etheric dimensions, those would be the homeland of this order of beings who are the custodians of this divine plan. So keep all that in mind while you check out these clips.
So in this emergency, men and people are beginning to turn towards a philosophy of life that we have always had, but for a long time we paid little attention to it. In the Orient, this was called the Ahat or Lohan or Rishi tradition, the esoteric schools of the East. In Europe and the West, it has been referred to as the schools of the adepts. And there has always been the belief that somewhere beyond, above, unseen, but more real than anything that we can possibly see, is the invisible government of the world. And this is the government of the adepts as defined by John Hayden in the 17th century. He said there is an order of beings living in the suburbs of heaven under the leadership of the Generalissimo of the world. And these who live in the suburbs of heaven, according to the Chinese, the Hindus, the Greeks, were all the mysterious benefactors of mankind, the invisible brotherhoods that cannot fail. The ancients believed that this government was located in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia, that with the motion of the poles, the alternation of the poles, it has traveled somewhat. But wherever it is composed of beings of our own order or of other orders who have been brought together for the purpose of making certain that humanity could not fail. They have always protected but never interfered. They will not come forth and save man from his own weakness, but they will help him to save himself through his own strength. They have brought teachings, wisdom, schools of thought. They established the ancient mysteries. They gave us the great world teachers. They are still quietly but inevitably working, and always will, and their instruments are enlightened and dedicated human beings. Now, many of these dedicated and human beings will never know that they have been selected for anything more than a common destiny. They will never realize that they are being especially used. But if they will be quiet for a moment and realize the facts about themselves, they may gain some interesting impressions. The famous statement of Lord Bacon is indicative of this point. He said that he was convinced that he had been born to be of advantage to mankind. Now, there are people who are born to be of advantage to other people. From the earliest life, they are dedicated without perhaps any idea of why or to what they are dedicated. But they become inevitably the servants of human need. These experiences happen to people. Sometimes what might be termed a series of curious circumstances that don't seem to make very much sense in themselves, but twist things around until suddenly the individual finds that he has what the old minister used to call a call. He is called to the Lord. Now, as it also says in that statement, many are called, but few are chosen. Some of these calls probably are emotional, some of them are hope, some of them are mental experiences without much validity. But if these calls that come to people change these people, give them a dedication to something greater than themselves, then many people, especially in the Orient, believes that when the individual is called to be more than himself has given the call, that somewhere he is appointed, he is nominated, perhaps out of previous lives, to perform a duty in connection with the preservation of the common good. This type of preservation, this type of dedication, has always existed.
So he was saying there that the invisible government impresses itself upon the world through agents who prepare themselves to be suitable servants of this role. And so if you want to find this invisible government and be a part of it, then you do so through purifying yourself, in a sense, not just physically, but also ethically and morally, and dedicating yourself to developing a skill or something that can be used to be of service to others, and also by looking inward and trying to contact the metaphysical source of things. And I'm not saying that from my personal expertise, although I do have some inward experiences that are valuable to me. But just in general, this is what Manly Hall teaches, and what he's saying in this lecture is that the true government of things is within consciousness, and you have to find this government and participate with this in the actions of this government by preparing yourself to be an instrument of consciousness and to let consciousness come through you and to guide you. And so that's really what this government is doing. This invisible government is one that is within consciousness and is guiding consciousness through this meditation. So Manly Hall is going to pick back up on these themes and explore them a bit further. And this is the final set of clips that I'm going to be doing in this video. So thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you got something from this, and I'll be back with some more content soon. Thank you. Cheers. God bless.
The Oriental peoples and many Western peoples are becoming at least abstractly aware of the mysterious organization of powers behind the scene of things that will continue to work. And many of them say, oh, why don't they come out and do something quick? What we really need now is some very powerful exhibition of divine intercession. But this isn't the way it can be done. It will never be done this way. Because if we do it this way, then authoritarianism takes over. If a power greater than our own is known to be leading us, then our own morality is damaged. We must not be right because some other power has made us too strong to be wrong. We cannot gain this light and this power or this insight as the result of something outside of humanity taking over and insisting that it be true. The old schools always, according to the records, always worked through human beings, because the human being himself must redeem himself. And the schools can only keep open the gate or be present to take care of those who make the attainment. When the disciple is ready, the teacher is there, says the Axiom of Hermes. And this is it. And this is always has been it. That only when the individual is capable of a complete dedication can he be used for the advancement of the common good. Then it is the individual who makes the claim. It is the individual who has earned the right. There will never be a time when we will not have guidance if we do not try to force our own guidance upon everything else. If we are still and know that we are God's children and working with God, and if we are still and know that the divine plan works, we will be able to recover from a great many of the fears and sorrows with which we have afflicted ourselves. In these times when there is so much problem, so many things are not the way we wish they were, we have a great tendency to panic. But the old medicine priest was wiser. Instead of panicking, he went out into the night, where he could feel an eternity moving in upon him. If you go out in the night, you see only the stars, maybe the moon. You sit quietly under this bowl of heaven with all of its lights. And if you are very still and very quiet, these stars open like flowers, and you behold the hierarchy. You behold the great universal plan, and you realize that man cannot frustrate the work of 100 billion suns, that he cannot destroy the great plan which has existed forever, and of which all existences we know are manifestations. He cannot expect or believe that this tremendous pageantry of purposes can fail. He knows that it is there and it will be fulfilled.